Vic Mornington, how's everybody doing? So this is a little bit of a different video compared to the ones that I usually do in this channel. This one is all about PBR, physically based rendering. It's the new rendering system, the graphical engine that London Lab has put into the Second Life viewer. Just before SL21B, they wanted PBR released to the public in time for SL21B. Personally, I think that was a bit of a mistake because as a lot of people are now seeing who are having problems with PBR, they released it too early. So, bit of a backstory here. Physically based rendering, which everyone's been hearing about, is basically a different way of rendering graphics and, more importantly, rendering surfaces on what you're looking at. With PBR, everything, this is the theory behind it at least, everything that has a surface, whether it be the chair or the sofa behind me, whether it be the floor, whether it be the walls, everything inherently has some sort of shine and some sort of reflection. That's why when you look at a PBR textured object, if you look really closely, there's a little bit of shine there, even if it's only a tiny bit of it. And if you look really closely, to some of them at least, there's a little bit of a reflection, even though there's only a tiny bit of it. The old rendering engine that we're all used to now, which was the advanced lighting model, was more of a front-loaded graphic engine. And when I say front-loaded, it means that some of the decoding was done by the CPU, that's the main processor, whether it's Intel or whether it's AMD Ryzen, right? Front-loaded means that the main CPU takes some of the graphics and interpolates it and then decodes it and then shunts it into the graphics card for the graphics card to serve to the monitor. PBR, along with a whole bunch of other graphics engines that are currently out there, are no longer really CPU bound. It's bound mainly to the graphics card, whether it's an NVIDIA graphics card, whether it's that new pointless Intel Arc garbage that nobody cares, sorry, but the Intel Arc graphics cards are just rubbish, they really are, or whether it's AMD Radeon cards. This is the reason there's been a major difference in the PBR rendering compared to the 5050 CPU graphics card render engine that Second Life used to use. And what PBR has basically uncovered is that a lot of people's graphics cards are simply too old. That's essentially what the problem is. Most of the people, not all, but most of the people who are having problems with PBR are using graphics cards that are 5 or 6 generations old. So we're talking GTX, not RTX, GTX 900 series cards, and going into the last of the GTX line, the GTX 1000 series cards and the GTX 1600 series cards. Well, the 1600 series cards are a lot newer than the old 1000 series cards. So to give you an idea of what I'm using, I am using a graphics card that's 2 generations old. For it to help about Firestorm, there is the PC specs there. Ryzen 7 5800X, it's a CPU from last generation, but the most important one is the RTX 2070 Super. Now again, I've got 2 computers here. One of them's the work computer, the work desktop, that I don't usually play Second Life on. That one's got a slightly better graphics card in it, but this one's got an old RTX 2070 Super. 8 gigabytes of RAM, memory and memory detected with an unlimited budget. Now, this first tip, and here's what I advise everyone watching this video to do, right? You want to go up to help, whether you're on Firestorm, whether you're on Alchemy, whether you're on the official London Lab viewer, it's all the same for this particular menu. Click on help and click on about. All your major PC specs will be in these lines here. What you're interested in is these 2 lines that you're seeing here. Graphics card memory and graphics card memory detected. Now those 2 lines are going to be very important, especially if you're on a Mac. Doesn't matter what model or make the Apple product is, It's just Mac, right? It's also going to be very important for people out there on a desktop Windows PC who has been suffering lots of crashes ever since overhauling to PBR, ever since installing a PBR viewer, whether it's the official Linden Lab PBR viewer, whether it's Alchemy, whether it's Firestorm, the current version of Firestorm that I'm using right now. If you're having a lot of crashes, if you're noticing that texture thrashing is going on, and what I mean by that is textures pop in focus, then they get blurry, then they pop in, then they get blurry, then they pop in. That's texture thrashing. That's the first sign that there's a problem with the memory detection on your graphics card. These two lines here are very important. If one of those lines, doesn't matter which one, if one of those lines is reporting 0 megabytes, it means that the OpenGL library is not able to access the base coding, not the base coding, but the base foundation, should I say, of the driver that you're using for your graphics card, which either means you're using a Mac that's got some kind of odd thing going on with the graphics card, or you're using one of the non-mainline version of NVIDIA or AMD based graphics cards. In the case of NVIDIA, you could be talking about one of the TI cards, titanium cards. Also in the case of NVIDIA, you could be talking about one of the newer Super cards. Now, the one I've got is a 2070 Super. It's not a new one. This is a rather old card I've got here. But if you're using one of the 30 or 40 series RTX cards, if one of those lines is reporting 0 megabytes, two things is going to happen. Number one, because the PBR, and more importantly the OpenGL engine that's running behind PBR, is not getting a correct report of how much memory or how much detected memory your graphics card has got, all the PBR and OpenGL engine is going to do is it's going to keep throwing textures at your VRAM, your video RAM, the memory on your graphics card. And because it's not being reported correctly, what usually happens when a new texture comes in, the memory's full, right? The memory decides that's an old texture that hasn't been viewed for 10 minutes. I'm going to delete that texture and replace that texture with this new one that's just popped in. However, if the memory is not being reported correctly, if one of those lines is at 0, what usually happens is the memory struggles. It decides not to dump the old texture. It tries to take the new texture in, but VRAM is full, so texture does not load correctly. That's why you're getting texture thrashing. There's a way around that, and this might solve a lot of the crashing and texture thrashing problems that a lot of people could be having, especially if one of those two lines is reported as 0 megabytes. Preferences. No matter what viewer you're in, go into preferences and then go into graphics. You've got the tabs along the top here. You want to go to hardware settings and you want to look for advanced settings, restart required, override VRAM detection. Now, this slider goes up in gigabytes. So, if one of the lines is reporting that you've got just under 8 gigabytes or just under 12 gigabytes, here's what I recommend you do. Don't go for the full gigabyte response. Now, in the help about menu, it reported that I've basically got an 8 gigabyte video card, but you'll notice here I've only put in 7. There's a reason for that. You want to give the graphics card at least 1 gigabyte of headroom, empty memory room, so other applications that you may end up minimizing to go to the background has still got some graphics card memory in there to fill up. Also, it's a little bit of headroom for Second Life itself. It also means that because the memory is now being reported correctly, it basically means that if there is a blip in the system, shall we say, and an old texture's not deleted for a new one to take its place, there's a gigabyte of headroom in the graphics card memory to still hold on to that bit of texture while at the same time loading the new texture in. So don't go for the fully don't put the slider up to the fully reported gigabyte. Always go 1 gigabyte below to give your graphics card a little bit of breathing room. It's something similar, to be honest, to what Windows itself does when it's left to Windows management, or in this case OpenGL management. Usually there's about 500 megabytes to 1 gigabyte of headroom left in the graphics card as empty space. But if OpenGL is reporting that you've got 0 in one of those lines, either total memory or memory detected, it's just going to screw up. It's simply going to screw up. So, that's tip number 1. Get a little bit of a scratchy throat. I think I'm getting a cold, so I might be coughing a little bit during this video. Now, tip number 2. Now we're going to go into basic graphics. So, the old lighting model, the advanced lighting model that we all recognise, there was a toggle switch in the old days that allowed people to basically toggle ALM on or off. And ALM was basically made famous because of two things: wind light and shadows. ALM is no longer switchable. The advanced lighting system that we all seen come into effect around about 2015, 2016, during Second Life's golden era, shall we say, was originally switchable. And it was switchable all the way up until PBR became a thing just before SL21B. Physically based rendering basically uses what was the front load graphics system of OpenGL, and it uses it to much better advantage of modern day graphics cards. Again, this is why older graphics cards is having a problem. So because of this, ALM can no longer be switched off, because without ALM, PBR simply doesn't work. So it's a catch-22. There is ways round it though. Now again, I'm using a graphics card that's coming on, what, 5-6 years old now, the old 2070 Super series. I am currently running preferences, graphics. I am currently running with the graphics quality cranked. It's all the way up to ultra. I've got the draw distance at 256. I've got shadows and mirrors all switched on. And if we look up there, I'm still getting a decent 15 frames per second. Now granted, there's no other avatars in view, and we're basically looking at scenery. If I was in a club, that FPS would have tanked down to about 5 or 6 FPS. But I am able to basically cam around in Magnolia City with all the shadows on. There's a tiny bit of screen lag going on, but it's not too bad. But I'm able to cam around as normal, doing my videos and all the rest of it. Now, here's the problem. When I'm doing a Mornington's at video, I've usually got my draw distance cranked up to over 700 meters because I want to see more than 2 sims away from where I'm standing right now. So if I do that, we're up at 672 meters now. Just watch the FPS tank. There it is up in the corner. You'll be seeing it slowly tank down as everything out in the distance starts to load in. Now we're under 10. 7. And when we get to this stage, when we get to 7, if I just spin, yeah, see that? See that? It's running like a slideshow now. That's unusable. That's unusable. Slideshows like that is completely unusable. There is ways around this though. Even though you cannot switch ALM off in the graphics settings, you can switch off the basics of ALM in order to claw back some FPS up there in the top right hand side corner. Avatar preferences. First of all, if you're not needing a mirror, switch mirrors off. But here's the thing, switching mirrors off when you're not looking at a mirror is not going to increase your FPS. Switching mirrors off will only work when you come into range of a PBR enabled mirror. So if you don't have a mirror in front of you or in view, you're not going to notice any bit of difference when you switch mirrors off. This screen space reflection stuff, keep that switched off as well. Just keep it switched off. Shadows, you want to switch that off. Reflection detail, static only. Reflection coverage, none. Keep point lighting the way it is. And what you're noticing here, look at that. 13.5, 13.7, 13.9, we're at 14 now. The FPS is climbing back up. Now again, I still have my draw distance up at 600 metres. Normal people don't have it that high. I'm going to put this back down to 256, which is the default for Ultra. And just keep an eye on the FPS up in the top corner. 25, 26, 27. Yeah, it's settling down at around about 26, 27 FPS. So the frames per second has practically doubled because I've switched off shadows, I've switched off mirrors, I've switched off the reflection stuff, but I've kept the draw distance at 256. And this is the thing about the PBR system. That's the thing about the PBR system. A lot of it is based off of the original advanced lighting that OpenGL used up until OpenGL's development basically ceased. What PBR has essentially done is PBR has taken the original graphics pipeline, shall we say, the original graphics pipeline that made ALM cast those shadows and make things shiny and make things reflective, and it's emphasized it to the point that it doesn't need the CPU to render, or at least partially render out some of the algorithms for that actual graphics reference, and instead shunts it directly to the graphics card. But because it's shunted directly to the graphics card, people with older cards are having problems. It's as simple as that. If you follow the tips I've given you in this video, you should get at least a 10 to 15 frames per second uplift. Now, those 10 to 15 frames per second will be completely wasted the minute you walk into somewhere like Muddy's Music Cafe or Big Daddy's 80s Club or Warehouse 21 when you've got 30, 40, 50, 80 avatars within your draw distance. Your frame rate's going to tank again. So it's, you've got to have a bit of give and take here, folks. You've got to have a bit of give and take. Now, I'm going to wrap this video up by giving everyone a warning. And I'm surprised Linden Lab hasn't mentioned anything about this. Mind you, they never gave anyone warnings about the impact that PBR would have. Currently, the Linden Lab viewer is using OpenGL. It's using the OpenGL graphics library as the basic code to run the viewer. And what they've done, they've gotten physically based rendering and basically glued it on top of OpenGL. Physically based rendering, PBR, has been around for the better part of 20 years. Now, there's some people that run around saying it's an industry standard. PBR's not an industry standard. It's never been an industry standard. If you go or check on Google to see how many games are actually using physically based rendering, the list looks long, but considering there's hundreds and hundreds of PC games out there that are not using PBR, and the vast majority of those hundreds and hundreds of games are AAA titles, like Call of Duty, Black Ops 6 that just got released, for instance. That's not using PBR. PBR was basically made to be based around one particular engine, and that engine is called, pardon me, I've got the hiccups all of a sudden, that engine is called Vulkan. Now, previously I said Linden Labs hasn't given any warning of this. For all the people out there with a GTX 900 or a GTX 1000 series card, like the 1080 series of graphics cards, and for that matter even people that are using the GTX 1600 series of cards, the 1660s, and for all the people that are using the AMD Radeon equivalents of those cards, 3 to 4 years time you will not have a choice but to update your graphics card. I'm guessing it's going to be 3 or 4 years from now. If Second Life is still going 3 or 4 years from now, you are going to have to update your graphics card, because I asked a question at the SL21B meetings, and it was basically to do with the fact that OpenGL that Linden Lab is currently using is now outdated. And the reason it's outdated is because development of OpenGL stopped in 2017. OpenGL is now so old that Apple, and this is going to be very important for Apple users out there, Apple has depreciated the OpenGL code in the drivers for their graphics engine cards. Now, when I say depreciated, what that basically means is Apple is no longer giving updates for Apple-based computers, Apple-based laptops. They're no longer doing updates for OpenGL drivers in the graphics cards for their computers. So what's going to happen as the years progress on, at least for the next 2 or 3 years, as Apple updates their graphics card drivers, they're no longer updating for OpenGL. They're no longer patching for OpenGL. So people that are using Second Life on a Mac are going to find things increasingly difficult to run. You'll have random crashes for no reasons. You'll have texture thrashing for no reason. That's because Apple is no longer updating their drivers. They're no longer updating their drivers for OpenGL. Why? Because OpenGL is dead. Linden Lab didn't want to admit it. A lot of other people don't want to admit it. But OpenGL as a platform is dead. It's been dead since 2017. Why? Well, because all the developers walked out. They shut the door on OpenGL, they switched the power off, and they padlocked the door shut. And the reason they did it is because they moved on to a new project that's called Vulkan. V-U-L-K, not C, it's not the pointy ear people from Star Trek. V-U-L-K-A-N. And Vulkan is essentially OpenGL 2.0. And the reason that the developers of OpenGL decided to close the door on OpenGL and move over to Vulkan is very simple. OpenGL is a very, very old system. It was based off of 32-bit back in the day. It started as a 16-bit system, was upgraded to 32-bit, was forced to be upgraded to 64-bit, and then it became just a morass, a spaghetti of code that was becoming a nightmare to actually stay on top of. Hence, Vulkan. They essentially got Vulkan, got the code base, the original code base for OpenGL, based it off of 32-bit, stripped out the 16-bit stuff, based it on 32-bit, overhauled it to 64-bit, and all the things they couldn't really do with OpenGL, they're now able to do with Vulkan. The chief engineer, and I think it was Patch Linden himself, also said when I asked this question about OpenGL and Vulkan, they've admitted that somewhere in the future, sometime in the future, Linden Lab is going to remove OpenGL and switch to Vulkan. Now, this comes with a double-edged sword. The good side of that is PBR will actually run the way it was intended. Because PBR, the version, the system of PBR that Linden Lab is using, was never meant to be glued on top of OpenGL. The reason is PBR was basically wrapped around the Vulkan codebase. Even though PBR can run on OpenGL, a lot of the features of PBR, like the full-out features, are basically being bottlenecked by the OpenGL codebase. And it will be continued to be bottlenecked because OpenGL is no longer being worked on. So when OpenGL is stripped out of the Linden Lab viewer and it's replaced with the baseline Vulkan codebase, there is going to be an exponential increase in how well PBR looks, how well PBR texturing performs, and how well the overall world of Second Life looks. But the bad side of that is people on older graphics cards are going to have to upgrade. You will not be able, you will simply not be able to struggle along with a GTX 900 or a GTX 1000 series card or the AMD Radeon equivalents. Even me with a 2070 Super, I'll be struggling slightly as well in 3 or 4 years' time when Vulkan code is injected into the viewer and PBR is fully opened up. Even I'm going to be struggling slightly, so take this as a warning. Take this as a warning. You've got probably, and I'm guessing here, 3 or 4 years to put some pennies aside to buy yourself a decent graphics card. Now, I'm not saying rush out and spend $1,500 or $1,600 US dollars on a 4090 right now. What I am saying though is put $500, $600 aside. Just put it aside. And in 3 or 4 years' time, don't go out and buy the latest and greatest. It's probably going to be, what, the RTX 5000 series by that point in time. Don't go out and buy the latest and greatest NVIDIA card. Buy a second-hand 3000 series RTX. The RTX 3060, RTX 3070, which is currently one generation behind the current generation. In 3 or 4 years' time, you'll be able to pick up a second-hand 3060 or 3070 series for under $500. Easily under $500 on Second Life, or not Second Life, on Facebook Marketplace. So again, you don't have to buy the latest and greatest card, but what I am saying is you will need to update, especially if you're on a 900 GTX or a 1000 GTX. You're going to have to update. There's no getting around it. You will have to upgrade your graphics card. So take that as a warning, folks. Again, you won't have to do it right now because there's zero sign of Linden Lab switching over to the Vulkan codebase. There's zero sign of them doing that, and I don't think they're going to do it for another 3 or 4 years, because we all know how slow Linden Lab are at updating things. Anyway, that's it from me, folks. Have a good one.